have this session anyway, so I would like to introduce Manuel Fasko, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Basel. He's currently working on a habilitation, and Mary Shepard and her metaphysics of mind. His other research interests lie in early modern philosophy, and particularly the British-Irish tradition of the 18th century, with an emphasis on metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and representation. And Manuel, if you have a PPT or a handout to share, you can go ahead.
Yes, I do. Yes, I will.
And just, I'm.
Thank you very much, Esther. So you need, or you or whoever is the host needs to let me share my screen.
I just changed my settings, so it should work now.
Perfect. Because I have really nice pictures, it would be a waste. Do you see my screen, I guess? Yes, okay, very good.
Yes, we do, but we see your, not your presentation mode, we still see your, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm on it. I'm on it.
Good.
So, there we go.
Perfect.
There we go. Good, so thank you very much, and also thanks for having me. I will talk to you about Mary Shepard's metaphysics more generally. And as you can see from my talk, I will try to argue that we should understand her as a proto-dispositionalist. So as I said, this is what I want to establish here. And the reason, or basically the main argument, is that mind and matter for her are powers, or as you could also call them, dispositions, or nowadays, they would usually be called dispositions. And these dispositions or these powers are in turn based in God, which I will argue is nothing but an infinite mind. And so he is best understood, or God is best understood as functioning similar to what McKittrick, for instance, calls a bare disposition, that is an irreducible and fundamental causal basis in her system in which mind and matter as base dispositions are rooted, if you want to put it this way. Now, two quick disclaimers for clarity's sake, since I try to bridge the gap a little bit between more contextual work here and more a systematical point of view. So by dispositionalism, I mean, in essence, the metaphysical position that properties have dispositional essences, and in that particular case, all properties, which is also sometimes referred to as pan-dispositionalism. And in fact, as implicitly already has become evident, I think Shepard is even more strict than that, or her position is more extreme than that, because in her case, it's not only that all properties are essentially dispositional, but her metaphysics as a whole is essentially dispositional. But I will say more about this in my closing words, basically. And also, I keep referring to her as a proto-dispositionalist for the simple reason that dispositionalism as a metaphysical position really gained traction under that label only in the 20th century or late 20th century. So this is just to make clear that she does not talk in terms of dispositions. And this is really me taking a contemporary label to make her metaphysics and the project behind her metaphysics more accessible for us. So good. I have 5 steps planned. I will briefly talk about Mary Shepard and her works because usually or sometimes you have an audience that is not as familiar with Shepard. So I will provide some general details. Then I will introduce the basics for my talk, which are her notion of mind and matter as power. Then I will talk about a problem, not a problem per se, but a problem for my argument, which would be if Shepard endorses substance as a metaphysical entity. And then I will provide how I think we can solve this in terms of my argument, and argue that her metaphysics is not only power first, but powers only. And I will conclude with some conclusions. Good. So maybe you are already familiar with that particular painting, but I nonetheless like to show it time and time again because it's the only known portrait or painting we have of Mary Shepard. She's the girl standing in the middle. That's her at age 14. And I like this painting also because it's in a way symbolic for the more general status of shepherd scholarship. Because while we can say that she, or we are allowed to say that she's a metaphysician, obviously, and also arguably Scotland's first female philosopher, we generally know very little about her. Most of our knowledge comes from a memoir which her daughter wrote, and which is fraught with all the problems that personal memoirs have. And Jennifer McRobert in the early 2000s did a lot of work to try and contextualize shepherd as much as possible. But she couldn't do that with a lot of primary sources, but more with basically intellectual history and reconstructing the context in which she was brought up, in which she worked, and try to put some substance on the few dates we have, like her marriage or the children that were born. So we know little. What we do know is that she at least wrote 2 books and 3 essays. The ones in red are the ones that are important for my purposes here, and these are her 2 books, which the 1824 one I will call RC, and EPU is the second book, and LMSM refers to this 3rd essay she wrote. As I also like to point out, she has had a similar fate than most women philosophers or female thinkers. That is, she was, or seems to be, rather well regarded in the period she was working with. So people reacted to her, people engaged with her work, be it critically or not, but they engaged with her. They didn't just ignore her. But afterwards, with the rise of the historiography of philosophy, her views, as so many others, just dropped from view until basically the mid-90s, where philosophers such as Margaret Atherton or the mentioned Jennifer McRobert did a lot of work to make a case for her philosophical, or for her being philosophically interesting and having said philosophically interesting stuff. And this has caught on, so that there has a lot of work been done, especially in the last few years. But most of this work still is confined more or less to her idiosyncratic notion of cause and effect, and her relationship to predecessors such as Hume and Berkeley, with whom she engages with in her books. And so her notion of power and its metaphysical status has not attracted much scholarly attention. The only noteworthy exception, and the only exceptions I have on the top of my head, is Antonio Lollardo's Powers in Britain, which also has is a chapter in a collected volume with a chapter dealing with shepherd. So I will, in a way, break some new ground and talk about an issue in shepherd that's, as will become evident, is clearly important but still little discussed. So, and why is it clearly important? We have here several quotations where she characterizes what the mind is. So she says, the senses and mind or powers adequate to sensation in general, mind or power of thought and feeling, the immaterial cause, that is, a principal power being must have a name and may be called soul or spirit. Or, and the last one is one of her favorite characterizations, the mind is a capacity or cause for sensation in general. Now, this characterization in turn raises some questions. So it's clear she calls it a power or cause or capacity. But what does it mean to call it a cause or capacity for sensations, or what are sensations for shepherd? And what does it mean to call it a cause? Both of these have shepherd-specific answers, because she has really, at least coming from an early modern perspective, as I do, she has really idiosyncratic answers to these questions. So for sensations for her are not just confined to our senses, for instance, but they encompass, and I quote here, every consciousness whatsoever. And sensations thus range from sensations of present sensible qualities, but they also include passions, such as pleasure or pain, which she sometimes calls feelings, hence the power of feeling. And also it includes the whole array of ideas you can basically have. So ideas of memory, reason, imagination, expectation, and so on, which is a class of sensations he sometimes dubs reasonings. So the mind is a power to have this kind, or basically it's a power for consciousness, or it's a cause for consciousness. So the question now is, what does it mean for her to say that it is a cause? And here it's important to note that she argues explicitly in distinction to Hume that causation is at least a tripartite relation, and that cause and effect are necessarily connected, and that synchronous. That is, the effect is included in the mixture of the causes. And what that means for her, she likes to illustrate with mathematical analogies. So she says, for instance, cause and effect might be presented by A times B equals C, A and B being the causes and C being the effect. Therefore, C is included in the mixture of the objects called cause. So her idea is not that you have A and B follows in a way, but really you need at least two things, A and B, and they mix together. And when they mix in a similar instant, that's what she means by synchronous, the effect arises. And so because it's the mixing, it's also, the connection is also strong and necessary, and not just some form of association or habitual association, as Hume argued. And so this becomes more evident when she says, cause means and really is the creation of new qualities from a conjunctions in matter or mind. I also put this quote here to illustrate that she thinks, because if you have a dualist picture in mind, for instance, coming from the early modern period, it's always a question, can matter and mind interact? For her, this is clearly the case. So matter and mind are causes, and they can conjunct, they can mix with each other. So this is also important going forward. Not in the least, because now that we know I have one more thing to say. Now that we know what it means to say that the mind is a cause for sensation, it's also important to note with this understanding of causality in mind that the brain, for her, the physiological brain, the organ, the bodily organ, plays an extremely important role. She calls it in EPU the exponent of the powers of the soul. And in RC, she says a different action of the brain is wanted for each variety of thought and sensation. And the reason for this is that the mind, as we saw, cannot cause sensation on its own. It needs to mix with something. And in our case, or the case of finite beings more generally, the point is that the mind always mixes with the brain to create sensations. So this is the minimum picture you have. But of course, the mind can also mix with things outside of us, with external bodies. So this is what I have here at the bottom of the slide. When Shepard says that the mind is a power or cause of sensations, she basically says that the mind causally interacts with the brain at least, and sometimes it also interacts with the senses as well as the body, our body more generally. For instance, when we have pain in our hand. And sometimes it also, or sometimes additionally, external objects or matter more generally comes into the picture to create these sensations. So as I said, it's at least two partial causes, but there can be, there's no number cap. There can be 5, 6, whatever causes that mix together to create a sensation. And so let us talk about these things that can causally interact with the mind to cause these sensations. So first we have the external objects. And there we also see that powers play an important role for her. So she says in RC, objects in relation to us are nothing but masses of certain qualities affecting certain of our senses, and which, when independent of our senses, are unknown powers or qualities in nature. So she clearly characterizes external objects in terms of powers, or explicitly does so. And the second quote illustrates more it illustrates the causal interaction point more clearly. So she says, objects should always be considered as those masses of qualities in nature exterior to the organs of sense, whose determinations of sensible qualities to the senses form one class of their effects. So if you take these things together, she says the external objects are powers, and that these powers can interact with our brain and mind to cause sensations. So this is also, Antonio Loloro also said, it seems like this understanding of powers allows her to solve the mind-body problem or have it not arise in the first place, because it's no question how mind and body interact. These are interlocking powers, and they can causally or freely causally interact here. So good. But for now, the important point is she also characterizes external objects in terms of powers. And the same, almost the same, one has to say, holds for matter. So for matter more generally. So in LMSM, she says, I define matter to be unperceived, extended impenetrability. And then shortly after, she says, external extension, which is matter here, is an unperceived cause fitted to create or produce the idea of extension on the mind, and also to be a capacity for the emission of unperceived motion. And in EPU, she writes, matter is the capacity of exhibiting upon a sentient nature, which is a term she uses to refer to the mind, the sense of solid extension in general. And in regard to our own body, she writes, the human body is the continually existing cause for the exhibition of perception of the perception of extension and solidity on the mind in particular. So again, we don't have a definition of matter in causal in power terms. I will return to that in a minute, but we have it in causal terms again. So matter basically is just is the cause for a certain sensation. So to quickly recap, mind is the power or cause or capacity or principle. She uses various words, but they all basically have the same extension for sensation. So it's the cause of consciousness, which requires causal interaction with the brain at least, and sometimes also the body and matter and external objects. Material objects, she says, are masses, or external objects to be more neutral, are masses of qualities, which she explicitly calls powers, which in turn require causal interaction with the mind to obtain as sensations. And matter, she says, is the cause or capacity for the sensation of solid extension and unperceived motion. She also throws in there, which in turn, again, requires causal interaction with the mind to obtain as a sensation. And so now I return to, or this basically, this characterizations give rise to two problems. And the first one I already hinted at. She's not as explicit in saying that matter is a power as she is in the case of mind or external objects generally. And one can make this problem harder if you take some other passages or have some other passages in mind where she even seems to speak as if matter has a power instead of being a power. But on the other hand, we also have seen, especially in the case of mind, that the terms power, cause, and capacity can be used interchangeably. And more generally, if you look at Shepard's word, power, you can say power talk, capacity talk, cause talk. It's all part of a large field of causal talk for her. And we also have seen that how does causation usually work? These things mix, and these things can mix because usually they are powers. So she doesn't make the blanket claim that matter is a power, but the way she speaks about matter strongly suggests that we can understand matter as a power as well. And this is also something, so here I follow Lolordo's lead, who has suggested that that Shepard endorses this view. So I think she's right here. The second and more fundamental problem we have is that Shepard says that we do not know the real essence of matter and mind. So Lolordo spells this out in saying that we only have a relative notion of mind and matter in as much as we only know and access them by their exertion. So we only know mind and matter in as much as there is causal interaction. What we do not know basically the unfiltered thing that is behind these powers. And so someone like Deborah Boyle, who has the longest and I'd say at this point most influential article on Shepard's notion of mind, she suggests in passing that mind and matters are capacities that inhere in something. And also coming from an early modern tradition, she suggests that this something could be substances, either one substance or two substances. And so what I now did, which is something no one has done so far, is I looked at what has Shepard to say about substances in the first place. Is there any textual evidence to substantiate this idea that she thinks that substance is a metaphysical entity and that these powers inhere in substances, which would be a rather classical Lockean picture, for instance. And it makes sense in as much as Locke is important to her. Good, so let me walk you through Shepard's substance use, or the use of the term substance. And the first thing one realizes if one embarks on that project is that she uses the term substance and substances comparatively little. And to give you a comparison, an explicit comparison, so she uses both of these terms around 20 times in RC and in EPU. And she uses the word power or powers, or the term, she uses it 100 times in RC and 200 times in EPU. So it's really, those are only a few, there are only a few instances of the term in the first place. And some of these instances, 2 or 3, are just not interesting here because they are obviously not metaphysical, because she speaks of the substance of these minor essays or the substance of 2 letters, where she basically refers to the important content or the basic points that these letters make. So they're not interesting for our purposes here. So it's not a metaphysical sense, which would be referring to something that underlies reality or would subsist by itself, or something in which properties could inhere in the first place, properties or powers. Then we have some uses that seem metaphysical at first sight, but I think are at least equally well, maybe even better explained as being physical or chemical. So at the time when Shepard writes, the metaphysical use is by no means the only one, especially in chemistry and also in physics. Substance is also used, but it's used slightly differently. So they use it, for example, to refer to a kind of matter, or to a definite chemical physical composition, or even that of which a physical body consists, which is not necessarily a metaphysical claim, but rather one really in a natural philosophical claim, as it were, or even a claim of science at this point. I mean, we are here on the brink where natural philosophy gradually passes over into what we would now call science. And so I have 2 examples here. She likes to talk about bread. I guess she adopts this from Berkeley, who also likes to talk about bread when it comes to substances. So she says, we can form a notion almost with certainty whether the substance placed upon the table has been truly elicited from such causes as could alone produce the compound object called bread. So here, the substance in question is this compound object. So she wants to talk about the bread as a piece of physical matter, as it were. And I mean, also to note here, the substance would not be fundamental, because the substance here has been elicited from causes. And as I highlighted before, these causes are arguably matter or some form of material object. And so there would be powers that have caused this substance. So this would not be the interesting kind of substance that grounds reality. And similarly, she says, in a loose and popular way, man undoubtedly conceived the sensible qualities of a loaf of bread as existing outwardly, along with the natural substance or particles of bread. So here it might be metaphysical, but it could also, again, be just more this physical, especially because she seems to equate natural substance and particles. So here it could also be just a rather physical use, again, to talk in a more abstract manner about this loaf of bread on the table. Good. And then we have a large chunk of instances where she uses substance, which are obviously metaphysical. And they are obviously metaphysical because they are from quotes from other philosophers, mainly Berkeley and Lawrence, who both endorse substances as metaphysical entities. And it's actually it's more, or it's around half in each book. So in RC, she refers to Lawrence, and in EPU to Berkeley. And over half of the instances where substance is used is in quotes from these two philosophers. And first of all, this raises the question whether she endorses substances, because it's just a quote, right? And this question is furthermore accentuated by the fact that when she answers them or answers points where they use substance, she often forgoes to use the term in the first place. So one nice example is she mentions Leibniz's pre-established harmony, which is in a way, which is a view about how substances, or is also a view about how substances are and how they are arranged. But when she discusses it, she does so in qualities of external objects and our inward perceptions of it. So she never mentions substances when she discusses this view. But there are three instances where she uses substance out of a quotation. One, and this is part of a Berkeley discussion in EPU, that's 211 to 216. And similarly with Lawrence. But even though she uses substance there out, not inside a quotation, and even though it's clearly metaphysical because it's part of a metaphysical discussion there, the question still remains, does she use it because she wants to endorse the view that there are substances, or is she just still paraphrasing what these philosophers have to say and uses the term because she wants to engage with it? And I think the latter is more likely, because outside of these narrow discussions where substance is basically forced upon her as a term because of the way these philosophers speaks, you don't find it. Or you don't find it with one notable exception. And this notable exception is the one I mentioned on the bottom of my slide. That's EP 387, where she writes that space would be the substratum or continuous existence of which the sensations were the varieties. So here we have a case where she rather obvious, or where we have this metaphysical use. So space would be a substratum, and it would be the underlying things in which sensations inhere, or at least that would be a fair paraphrasing of this instance. But as I highlighted, this point is made as a part of a hypothetical train of thought. And she starts out by saying, if, for the argument's sake, there should be supposed, and then she goes on, and at some point she said, should be supposed, amongst other things, that space would be the substratum, So the point here is, okay, there she uses it metaphysically, but it's hypothetically. So all in all, I say, if we look at her use of substance, there is no compelling evidence. There is surely no smoking gun, which would indicate that Shepard endorses the existence of substances as metaphysical entities. And so I think Boyle's suggestion can rather safely be rejected. So with this, let me turn to the alternative, or what I call here the solution. And this solution is, as you will see, a development on something that Antonio Lolordo already suggested. So as I just have tried to establish now, there is no compelling evidence for attributing a belief in metaphysical substances to Shepard. And if you accept what Lolordo says or follow Lolordo, there is even a passage that would suggest the contrary. So in EPU 388, she writes, this substance would exist as the capacity of an individual mind. So as Lolordo points out, it seems here as if she's equating or reducing substance to a capacity. And I think, yes, that's true, but it's important to note that this particular claim is also made in the context of that hypothetical train of thought I introduced earlier. And so I'd say we should take it with a grain of salt at least, because otherwise we have passages that stand in tension, right? We have the claim about space being a substratum, and we have this reducing of substance to a capacity. And it would require more thorough work to see if you can dissolve that tension. But for now, I think just the fact that she's introducing it as a hypothetical, as if for the argument's sake kind of thing, means we shouldn't take either passage too seriously. But even in absence of this passage, what I do agree on with Lolordo is that we should at least understand Shepard's metaphysics as powers first. So we have seen matter, external objects, mind, all of them are defined or characterized in terms of power, capacity, cause, or principle, which is basically, you can use, as I said, use it interchangeably. And based on this, I actually even think we should go farther. We should say Shepard's metaphysics is best understood as powers only. And I will defend this claim in this section, even though, as Lolordo also has pointed out, there is no blanket claim from Shepard's side that powers can exist on their own. So it's the case I'm making is circumstantial, because Shepard just has this epistemic humility about her and says we don't know about the essences of stuff, we just have to face it. But nonetheless, you can make a compelling case that even though she does not say it, she arguably endorses this position. And so, again, here I follow Lolordo's lead. This is based on a suggestion she makes at the end of her chapter. So in distinction to Boyle, she does not think that powers inhere in substances. She thinks there are only powers. But she also points out that the way Shepard speaks, there is this possibility that mind and matter as powers belong to something that is neither matter or mind. And she speculates, really in closing of her chapter, she speculates that this must be God. And she says, knowing Shepard, she sees no other possibility. And I think this is correct. I think this is spot on. I even think you can underline it with textual evidence. So I have brought a nice quotation here. So Shepard says, mind and matter are coming from him, referring to God, living in him, supported by him. So this is basically exactly what Lolordo suggested is the case. It's rather explicitly affirmed here. So if mind and matter are in God, the question then is, what is the metaphysical nature of God? Because if God would be a substance, we still would have some endorsement of substances as a metaphysical entity in the form of God being a substance. And so luckily, Shepard has numerous things to say about God and God's nature. She likes to call him an essential and continued existence, calls it unbounded essence, an underived being, and points out that God is self-existent, which is interesting on its own, and is there to give you like a fuller and clearer appreciation of the way she understands God's nature. But the crucial point for me is that she repeatedly insists that God, or at least insists that God has a mind. So she calls, sometimes it's even close to saying God is a mind. So she speaks of God's eternal mind or the great universal mind, speaks of the mind consciousness of deity. So we have seen, or I have argued, that in the case of finite minds, minds are just powers. Now, the crucial question is, if God has a mind, is this also just a power? Or can we understand God's mind in these power terms as well? And basically, is there a univocal notion of mind at play? And this question also arises coming from an early modern perspective, because even in the early modern period, there were still huge, going back to the scholastic period, there are huge discussions in what way can you apply certain terms which are applicable to finite minds to the unique case, to the infinite mind, or the infinite being that is God. So it's a valid, from a historical point of view, it's a really valid and important question whether God is a mind in the same sense as humans and other finite beings. And I think we can, there is a case to be made that she has a univocal understanding of mind, so that God is a mind in the same sense as we are. Because she does discuss the main difference between humans and other finite beings and God, and she says, or she does so and discusses in terms of, and I quote here, God being essential and dependent being, or different. Excuse me. The difference is one between essential and dependent being, between the small circle allotted exercise of each animal sensorium and that which is as unconfined as infinity. So the main difference she notes here is just that God is essential and finite beings are dependent. And she even spells out what that means in detail when it comes to the mind. And one important point she makes, which she makes at length in essay 12 of EPU, is this difference between God as an essential being and us as derived being is that God's mind does neither require a bodily organization to exist nor to be actualized. So God, in difference to us, God does not need a body to have sensations. So for instance, she writes, only derived essences, so finite beings, require organs in relation to surrounding matter to keep up and alter their perceptions. But she says explicitly, this is not the case for the necessary eternal mind of God. So there is one difference, but this does not pertain the mind as a capacity for sensation, but just the way how the mind gets to cause these sensations. And the second difference she stresses in terms of this derived essential contrast is that in distinction to us, God's mind is never passive. So she says that the human mind can be suspended in dreamless sleep and sometimes need to be revived out of this dreamless sleep again. But this is not the case with the deity. I have here a rather long quote where she writes, the eternal essence, which is God, in whom must have resided the original capacity for all qualities, there must have essentially existed not only a mind or capacity to feel, but that coalescence of qualities which must have formed his magnificent and innumerable perceptions. So there are two things to note here for me, or which I like to draw your attention to. And the first is, she explicitly says or calls God's mind the capacity to feel. And this is also a term or terminology she often uses when referring to human mind. So this further substantiates the suggestion that there is a univocal notion of mind at play. And second of all, as I said, the difference she stresses by the end of the quote is, again, that God's mind is never passive. Because if you know Shepard or are aware of Shepard's terminology, you know that perceptions for her are nothing but conscious sensations. So these are sensations you are explicitly conscious of. And when she says here that God has magnificence and innumerable perceptions, she implicitly says that the point here is God only has perceptions. There are no, in our case, we sometimes have sensations of which you are not explicitly consciously aware. But this is not the case with God. God is aware of all the sensations that are in God. And while we basically have a train of sensations which can be interrupted in dreamless sleep, in God's case, it's just everything is instantly there and instantly consciously perceived. That's the difference. But it's not a difference in terms of, is the mind a capacity for sensations in the first place? The point is just our capacity can be passive, can be in need of actualizations, while God's capacity is just always active. It's always actualized. The power is just, God is active power, and our power can be active or passive. So I think there's a good case to be made that God is or has a mind, at least.
Manuel, I would like you to conclude. Well,
oh, sorry.
By 45. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I'll.
Okay.
I'm
sorry to.
No problem at all. I will be able to wrap it up in 3 minutes, though, because I'm almost at the end. Good. So, God has a mind. God has a mind. But the question is God nothing else but a mind? And again, Shepard does not make this blanket claim. But if you consider the following, she says the universal mind, the infinite space for his residence, the amalgamation of all possible qualities in nature in one being necessarily existing. That's a passage where it characterizes God. And if you now think about that, God does not have a body, she says so explicitly, and God's mind needs infinite space. There is literally no room for anything else. So if God's mind so we know that God has a mind. Sometimes she even talks as if he is a mind, and this mind requires infinite space. What else could there be, basically? That would be the rather simplistic point I would try to make at the end. Plus, we get philosophical advantages if you understand God as pure active power, because similar to the situation with the mind-body problem, this is the second point here. If God is a power, then it's easy to see how he can causally interact with the world and all its parts, because it's just powers, and all these powers are just there to interact with each other. So this really gives her a nice and simple account of how her rather idiosyncratic notion of causality will work. And also, Lalorde points out, sometimes she says or speaks as if the world and God are not really distinct, so that God basically is the whole world and the whole world is God. And again, if God is a power and you have powers that inhere in powers, this makes a ton of sense. But if there is something behind God in which God inheres, or God's mind power inheres, this becomes strange. Good. So here as you can see from the middle part, and given the need to wrap up, we just have powers. And matter and finite mind should be understood as what sometimes is called base dispositions, because God functions as a bare disposition. So God is an ultimate causal basis for everything, and mind and matter as dispositions are based in God. So we just have two kinds of dispositions, really. And with this in mind, I think I have cashed in on the aim I have formulated, namely that we should understand her metaphysics as a case of proto-dispositionalism, which I have done by substantiating a suggestion by Lalorde and arguing that mind and matter and even the infinite mind should be understood in terms of power. And here I am just fully upfront with you. I have sidestepped the issues of relations, because there is some discussion whether relations could be self-standing metaphysical entities. But really, as a closing point, even if relations would exist, and if there were dispositions and relations in her metaphysics, I still think we can say that she endorses one of the strictest power ontologies available from a contextual as well as a contemporary point of view, because dispositions would still make up the vast number of entities in her system. And with that in mind, I think she has a brand of dispositionalism that is interestingly different compared to Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian approaches that also dominate today's discussion. And further down the line, it will be interesting to think about whether Shepard's brand of dispositionalism can solve some of the systematical problems that dispositionalism as a position is usually charged with. But for now, I'll close 2 minutes late, but with all the gratitude for your attention and looking forward to a discussion. Thank you.